Let's talk about a time when the world was tearing itself apart, and one group of nations dared to say, no, we're not playing this game. This is the story of the non-aligned movement, a truly radical attempt to find a third way in an age of superpowers.
I want you to imagine it's the 1950s. The entire globe feels like a chessboard, and there are two giants staring each other down, the USA and the USSR, and they're both looking at you, demanding you pick a side. Capitalism or communism, east or west. But what if there was another option? What if you chose neither?
Well, that third option is exactly what gave birth to the non-aligned movement, or NAM for short. At its core, the idea was simple, but also kind of revolutionary. It was a bunch of countries, many of them brand new, basically declaring that they refused to be pawns in the Cold War. They were going to chart their own course. So how does an idea this bold even get started? Well, to understand that, you have to look at the world right after World War II. It was a moment of huge change and, honestly, a lot of tension. It was the perfect environment for a whole new way of thinking to emerge.
It really was a perfect storm. On one hand, you had the intense rivalry between the US and the Soviets, pressuring everyone to pick a team. But at the very same time, old empires were crumbling. Dozens of new nations in Asia and Africa had just fought, sometimes for centuries, for their freedom. So the last thing they wanted was to get tangled up with a new superpower through military deals like NATO or the Warsaw Pact.
Now, this idea didn't just appear out of nowhere. It was driven by 5 incredible visionary leaders. You had Nehru of India, who was like the intellectual father of the whole thing, Tito of Yugoslavia, the architect who gave it structure, Nasser of Egypt, a powerful voice against imperialism, Sukarno of Indonesia, who hosted the first crucial meeting, and Nkrumah of Ghana, a true giant of African liberation. Each of them brought a vital piece to the puzzle.
And what they all agreed on was this powerful, clear vision. This wasn't about being passive or just sitting on the fence for every issue. No, it was about having the freedom, the sovereignty, to make your own decisions in the world without the big guys breathing down your neck.
You can really break the movement's history down into 4 main chapters. First, you've got the early years, when the idea was just taking shape. Then came its golden age, right at the peak of the Cold War, when it exploded in size. But then, boom, crisis hits. When the Soviet Union collapsed, the movement lost its main reason for being, and it spent a decade trying to figure out what to do next. And that leads us to today, an era where it had to completely reinvent itself. And that crisis, it was truly existential. Think about it. If your entire movement is defined by being non-aligned between 2 superpowers, what on earth do you do when one of them just disappears?
The whole logic of the movement was designed for a 2-player game. But by 1991, that game was over. The bipolar world was gone, and in its place was a world with one dominant superpower, the United States. The movement's original raison d'etre, it vanished, literally overnight.
And it wasn't just the end of the Cold War that caused problems. You had other things going on too. Member countries started fighting with each other. A lot of nations realized it was just more practical to get friendly with the US for economic help. Plus, powerful regional groups like the African Union started to feel a lot more relevant to people's daily lives. At the end of the day, simple pragmatism started to win out over ideology.
For a lot of people, that could have been the end of the story. Fade to black. But it wasn't. The non-aligned movement did something remarkable. It adapted. It found a whole new mission for a new century.
The movement's focus shifted, big time. Instead of just being about political neutrality, it became this powerful voice for the developing world, what we often call the Global South. The new battles were against things like economic inequality and climate change. The mission became about pushing for reform at the UN and building what's called South-South cooperation, which is really just developing nations helping each other solve their own problems.
And don't mistake that identity crisis for it becoming irrelevant. Today, NAM has 120 member countries. Just let that sink in for a second. After the United Nations, it is the largest group of states on the entire planet. That is a massive diplomatic force.
So, this brings us to the big question. What does the non-aligned movement actually mean today? Well, its identity has evolved in a really interesting way to meet the challenges of our modern world.
Here's probably the biggest shift of all. The whole philosophy has morphed from non-alignment into something people now call multi-alignment. It's not about refusing to pick one of 2 sides anymore. In today's world, with multiple centers of power, the US, China, Russia, the EU, it's about engaging with all of them without being permanently tied to any of them.
And this really gets to the heart of it. The goal isn't just neutrality for its own sake anymore. It's about achieving what's called strategic independence. It's the ability for a country to look at the world and make its own choices based on its own interests, building different relationships with different powers on different issues. It's about freedom of action. Which leaves us with one final thought to chew on. As new global powers rise and the world gets more and more complex, is that founding idea of the non-aligned movement, that core quest for strategic independence, not just still relevant, but maybe more essential than it has ever been?